Hi there, and welcome to Next Frontier. My name is Thomas Anderson, founder and CEO of Responsibly, and Next Frontier is my show about sustainability in the supply chain. Today, I'm talking to Kenny Kaluiji. Kenny has a really interesting story. He started working with supply chain sustainability in the oil and gas industry in Angola, where he was on the ground conducting health and safety audits with suppliers. He's since moved to Norway, founded a few companies and specialized in emissions and the carbon markets. But Kenny is still highly involved with the African continent, so a large part of our conversation centers around working with overseas suppliers in high-risk regions like Africa. So we discuss what it's like being on the ground in these regions, conducting health and safety audits, and when and how to trust audit data. We also discuss climate justice and circularity and how, for example, the electronics supply chain ends up creating huge waste dumps, like the Agbogbloshie in Ghana, that are notorious for unsafe and unethical labor conditions. This happens, of course, because we don't think enough about the end-of-use part of the value chain, and we're simply not good at recycling. But there are some really interesting regulatory initiatives out there, like the subsidies in Austria that subsidizes electronics repairment, making it much more feasible to repair a device instead of replacing it. So we discuss these topics and much more. Okay, Kenny Kaluiji, founder of Decarbonify and Baobabpad. Here we go. Hello, Kenny.
Hey, there's the main man.
Good to see you, man. How are you doing?
Thomas, not too bad, bro. How are you?
That's good to hear. I had a good morning. As you know, I have a small kid, three years old approximately.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Wow.
Ah, you didn't know that?
Yeah,
No.
wow. So there's a lot of not so much sleepless nights now.
Yeah, well, a bit. He was up two times this night, but I
Oh,
think
there you go. Yeah.
that's been 3 years running now, right? So
Yeah,
sort of used to that.
experience.
But he has a best friend at daycare, right? And
Oh, that's
the
good.
two, they're so cute when you deliver them. They just start giggling and playing and so on. So that made my day. So I had a good start to the day.
That's good, man. No, good to hear. Now I had a good weekend as well, though I got a little bit sick and my voice might be a little bit cramped.
Uh-oh.
I had a cold. A friend of mine just took me out for a run, and then we ended up running 21 kilometers in minus 18 degrees. So,
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
we are all like frozen. We are running and we are all frozen.
That's incredible. I did see
I know.
that you did quite a bit of running, right? But then I was thinking Norway, it's too cold to run.
No, it's very cold actually. I think in Norway there's they say there's nothing. I think it's kind of like a very Nordic saying that there's nothing like a bad weather, right? It's just bad clothing.
But that's so Norwegian. They always say that, right?
Maybe
It's never
very
cold.
Norwegian,
You're just not wearing the right clothes.
I know, it's just like, hey, it's not cold, it's okay. You just need to like woo and all these kind of things. So I'm
Exactly.
bad at that. Having lived in Norway for 8 years, I'm still like, what is this woo? Like, people, oh, you need this kind of woo. I'm like, what is that? And
But
everybody tells
it's
me
a fair
about a different woo, I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah,
That's fair.
great
But it
experience.
is a fair point, though. I'm also not good at it. But you guys have it. I think you guys still have it better than us because there it's cold and it's snow. In Denmark, we're now gone with the snow and we're back to raining outside, which just
Oh
sucks.
man, yeah. Today it actually rained, which was kind of like okay. If there's just been too much snow. If the rain comes in, and there might be some sunshine coming soon. Springtime.
Exciting
There you go.
stuff. But Kenny, welcome to Next Frontier.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. Wow, what a wild card you got here. Is this your second pod that you're having?
We have a few ones in the bank, but we haven't released anything. So you might be the first one we release. Let's see. But it's
Well,
still all
what a
you.
wild card here. But I'm really excited to be part of this, man. Thanks a lot for inviting me on this one. I think it's a very important topic as well. Talking to you about. I know you're
Yeah,
passionate
100%.
about this, and I'm pretty much in the same lane on passion for sustainability and making things right for the planet and people as well. So yeah, we're in the same
100%.
boat. Yes, sir.
I'm very excited about talking to you about that, Kenny, and I actually want to hear more about how you got into sustainability. But there's so much to talk about, right? So you've gone from qualifying suppliers for health and safety in Africa to founding and running a climate startup in Norway. So that just sounds like a super interesting journey. And
Yeah,
I want to talk to you about both, right?
yeah.
Because I'm really excited about your perspective on working with overseas suppliers. I know a lot of our listeners will be thinking about that with all of the human rights due diligence and so on coming up, given that you've had boots on the ground there. But Kenny, let's start out with the beginning, right? Like, tell me a little bit about how did you go from occupational health and safety in the oil and gas industry to working with sustainability, the carbon markets, founding your own company, and so on. How did you get into sustainability, Kenny?
Man, bro, it's quite a long story, right? I hope I can shorten it down in a very creative way. So my background, like you said, is pretty much oil and gas. And my education was economic development studies. But then I ended up going into this lucrative industry, right? Where there's oil, everybody wants to run to the oil because the oil money is always like high paying. And
Especially
I
in
ended up
Norway.
like, especially in Norway, in Angola too, right? For if you're working for most of these companies in Angola, for example, they are like international oil and gas companies. So you pretty much have the same standards in terms of salaries, and standards in terms of how you treat people in the workplace and all these kind of things. Occupational health and safety rules are very international. So I managed to sneak in into the very lucrative industry, and that's how I joined oil and gas as occupational health and safety. But before that, I had to do a certification with. I'm a certified what is called it's NIBOSH. It's a UK based occupational health and safety certification for
Okay.
managing like international hazards and safety and all these kind of things. Yeah. So when I finished that, I was like, I need to go into the oil, and everybody's like, that's their dream, right? When you're growing up with this industry that you just hear of, and then you get to actually get there. So I managed to get in the oil and gas. Very easy because I spoke English, and in Angola we speak Portuguese, but I grew up from another country, so you know I was speaking very fluent English, and
Mhm.
and I met this guy who said, Kenny, wow, you speak English? 30 seconds, he hired me. That was easier, right? But then I, working the oil and gas, both upstream, work with a company, major oil and gas companies. I won't mention their names. I know on the upstream side, understanding drill bits. I also went to Houston, Texas, to study what is called drilling technology as well. It was just like a short, upskilling training for like 1 to 2 weeks. And you want to just go deep, right, in drilling, and I was like, wow, this is my stuff here. Then joined another downstream company, more on the downstream upstream, where we were producing like in huge subsea production systems for the oil and gas. No, this is more for production. Upstream is more like drilling and digging the wells up and trying to find the oil.
Mhm.
Downstream is more on production, storage, and all these kind of things. Yeah, and transportation, obviously. So having worked in those settings, I was like, wow, this is great. The money was very good. I was getting home with almost like $8,000 every month. I'm like, wow, this is great. But that's pretty much the oil and gas money, right? It's like there's such so much money there. But I think one thing that was really, things that I was actually passionate about with my job was that I was making people go home safe. I think that was the thing, right? There's a lot of production. We had a lot of, it was a $2.5 billion project, and then there's always like accidents, right? And I was really much in charge of making sure that people actually go home without getting injured, or they have the right conditions to work, and all these kind of things. Yeah. So that was my occupational health and safety part, and I think I love the job because I would help people to go home safe. I'm always trying to be in the service of others, so so I think I really like that job. But over time, I got this fatigue of doing the same stuff, right? It's in the morning you have this a toolbox meeting, where you talk about safety, about how you behave today. You tell this, you tell like really big people, adults, and even young people as well. But then it's a culture as well that you're trying to build around safety as you go through the day, and that has to be every day, and then it becomes very routine. and most of the oil and gas, documentation standards, it's pretty much routine work as well, right? So I got a little bit fed up, and then I decided to quit.
Okay.
I decided to quit. I was quitting almost $8,000, salary. I said I'm gonna do something different. I applied for like different studies in Norway and Canada. I wanted to do something out of oil and gas, because I saw also during my time in the oil and gas that climate change was hardly discussed, global warming, and there was a lot of pollution as well, right?
Mhm.
Where the local standards, on the environmental aspect, they're actually very weak than the international standards. But companies take advantage of those standards, which are, a little bit okay. Like you can just throw some water, 10% into the ocean that is, polluted. Some of the local standards are very weak. Some
Mhm.
international companies that come with very strong standards, but I know they're always trying because they cannot clean up all the water out to take it from from offshore to onshore and clean up. It's a huge cost, right? So most of the companies that might just dump the water into the ocean, and that creates environmental damage eventually. I saw there was that lack there, but also just the way the oil and gas is set up. It's very conservative. You're talking about a supply chain where you produce oil in one country, take it outside to clean it up, and then the oil comes back, at the premium to the people that actually needs the oil. But then the
Mhm.
oil is actually, produced just right in the backyard. But that is just the culture of, the establishment of supply chain issues, right? Where there's no, I'm sure companies would invest in a refinery anywhere in the world where there's there's oil and gas, right? But the oil has to go out, they get it cleaned, and then come back, and then we pay. And then today, I think we're talking about 600 million people in Africa that don't have access to electricity or just energy, right?
Mhm.
It's just these issues of, if you look into the root cause of what's happening, is pretty much these issues where, yeah, they could have access to energy if that was actually accessible, it was
Yeah.
affordable, and but then it's not. It has to go out, come back with a premium price, and nobody can afford that. So it's that's the
It's
deficit that
really
we're living
sad, right? You have so
with.
many raw resources and natural resources, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
not accessible.
Yeah, at the end of the day, there's a lot of people without access to energy, right? And that could be electricity, but also like access to energy, like
Mhm.
fuel and all these kind of things. And but because it comes at a very high price. So I think for that, I think I was just getting a little bit frustrated with how things were working.
Mhm.
And then I started to move to Norway. I did a master in energy and environment in Stavanger, very cold, first time in Europe.
Mhm.
First time in Europe, and then it's really cold, and
You
but
go
it
all
was
the
the
way up
first
north. I love that.
all the way up north. And a lot of people ask me like, Kenny, why did you go to Barcelona, Portugal? Why here? I get that question most of the time. Like, why Norway? Why don't you? It's cold. It's, social life doesn't exist here. But I think eventually I love the environment.
Was that because of the oil industry? Because that would have been natural for me. Like you work with oil in Angola. Norway has a huge economy for oil, right?
Mm.
Was that what drove you to Norway?
I think that could have been right because I work for a Norwegian oil and gas company in
Mhm.
Angola, so I think
Got
there
it.
was that influence of the Norwegian culture, and I started running. I'm like a very religious runner, and I started actually running with Norwegians who actually took me for the first time to run back in Angola. Like, hey, Kenny, you want to run? I'm like, I don't like running. Let's go. From that moment, I started running. And then when I came to Norway, I just continued with that culture as well. And then I just love the environment here. It's very calm. It's very safe as well. It's the nature is actually great. But over time, studying a master in climate and energy environment, I did my master thesis on supply chain issues, where I was looking into value chains. I didn't
Mhm.
call them supply chains. I replaced supply chains for value chains. So I was looking to like innovative solutions for an oil and gas company actually that I worked for, in Angola. So they gave me an opportunity to do like a study on, this, what, strategy on, low carbon technology that they were developing, and they came up with what is called offshore wind and also like carbon capture technologies, kind of like to kind of like they're transitioning within that that landscape of the energy transition. So there was a carbon capture technology that was being developed in the system, but also like offshore floating wind as well. So all these are things that we was covering in my master thesis. But I think there was a challenge, obviously, getting to talk to their suppliers. So I think that's where the starting of my new company started. The idea of like, oh, it's really hard to talk to suppliers. It's not hard. It's really hard to get the data as well. Most of the suppliers are called. They never responded. They didn't know about climate change or carbon emissions, scope one, scope two, scope three. So
Hmm.
that was like, oh wow, this is quite very serious. So I launched a startup company. That was to focus on scope three emissions and just for suppliers to be able to submit data and all these kind of things. And yeah, that's the journey there. It's a long story, Thomas, but
But
you
it's
know,
very interesting. So was it basically like being exposed to some of the unfairness with the oil industry, and just being super deep in that and noticing climate change and pollution locally and so on? Was it like a local thing that drove you to really think about climate and wanting to actually make a difference about that?
good question. Yeah, I think that was the trigger was very local, right? I think
Hmm.
it's things that you see, people don't talk about global warming, they don't talk about climate change, it's the safety part was, very important, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a local, it's when you get injured in the oil and gas industry, it's a lot of downtime that could cost your company about $10 million
Mm.
if there is no work as a company, right? So I think safety, I think over time in the oil and gas has really improved, but the climate part, obviously, they didn't have a clue on addressing these issues, right? It's just now that we see like all the companies with a flag on sustainability, right? I was like, oh wow, all these sustainability claims, but some few years ago, it was just like safety, 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 right?
Yeah.
Which is very important, obviously. But then the planet as well, we didn't see that picture of the water being dumped into the ocean because they
Yeah.
can't clean it up after the drill, and all this mud, polluted mud, and the ecosystem in that ocean there. So yeah, I think seeing those issues, I think I was triggered. Obviously not by money, but at least by impact and change, right? I
Hmm.
wanted to kind of like come to Norway, do something different, and go back and create something that or just like try to. My idea was to, which is very strange, was to like join the corporate here and stop the climate. These guys doing these kind of things back in Africa. That was my strategy. But even but to get the corporate here as somebody, the person of color has also struggled, like
Hmm.
very much, because it's so hard to actually get the jobs, even when you're like, oh, I'm good at this, I'm good at that. So I think that as well really kind of like hit me. But I mean, I started my own thing, trying to help companies in anywhere that I could, and just to get them understand climate change. And I've been writing about climate change in Africa as well.
Hmm.
Talking to some groups in Africa as well on climate change, which is great, right? I think now this topic is up and running. It's a huge topic that needs to be addressed, especially for Africa, right? Because that's where we see a lot of impacts there, in terms of like climate change impacts. We don't feel it here.
Hmm.
There's people without
Yeah,
electricity.
100%.
There's climate. These are climate risks. They're happening in these places that you can never just imagine that. Yeah, pretty
It's a
much. I
very
think that
good
was the
point.
trigger. It was very local. I didn't have a global picture of climate change. I think I had a local picture of, oh, what's happening, right? Why are these people bypassing some of the things, And most of the time, people pay. Companies then they'll just pay for pollution, right? If they get a fine, they're just like, how much is that? I mean, they're making like 10x. Their break even is like 5 years, 6 years. They have a break even. The rest of like 25 years of a lifetime of an oil rig is just like profits, like it's just windfall profits.
Hmm.
So even paying for pollution, companies are able to pay for that because they're making 10x for
Yeah.
that investment. So yeah.
And you said some very interesting things there, Kenny. Two things I want to deep dive on. So one thing you said, which I think it's very interesting, right? Because we talk often about, okay, what's going to happen if we hit like a 2 degree warming, 3 degree warming, 4 degree warming, etc. What are the impacts going to be?
Yeah.
And in Europe and the Western world, we'll probably have a lot of the resources to deal with those impacts, right? But you're not going to have that in poorer countries in Africa, for example. So I think you're absolutely right. You're going to feel much more of the impact there, even though the pollution actually is happening in the Western world, right? So there's a very unfortunate balance there, where the impact is being felt where it's not made. I also really like what you said which I think is interesting because we've been on this journey for sustainability. Like 5 years ago, it wasn't a big topic, right? But it is now, at least in Europe. How is it in your experience across the African continent, Kenny? Where's sustainability going? Is it kind of moving in the same pace that it is in Europe, or is there justifiably still a focus on some of the just getting the economic up and running and the social issues and so on?
Good question. I mean, spot on question, Thomas. There. I mean, I think climate change governments are now awakening to that because of the impacts, right? Where
Hmm.
there's like huge floods today, it takes out homes, and but people don't understand that.
Hmm.
It's like, yeah, it's just rain, like just a lot of rain,
Yeah.
but it's like huge flooding, and you can see the seasons. There's like dryness as well. There's like droughts and all these kind of things that are happening, right? And over time, these are things maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the weather conditions were very okay. You could fall like this is a rainy season. It's going to just be a rainy season where, you grow crop and harvest crop. But now these things have changed, right? You can't have that consistency of, oh, this is a season that's coming. We don't look to that anymore in the African landscape. And these are the impact that people obviously know. Some that are a little bit more aware about these issues, they understand that this is climate change. But a lot of people, in like very remote, they don't understand this is climate, right? Because
Hmm.
they don't understand how we define climate change. And for them, it's just like, yeah, it's a bad weather today. It's just going to rain all the time. But these are the impacts that we see, right? Hitting these places. A lot of rainfall and flooding, and eventually, I think government, from what I'm seeing, that they are picking up that agenda to address climate change in Africa, which is actually very good. I like that, but again, it's also the climate equity, right?
Hmm.
It's investment in infrastructure. I think that's actually what's missing. Adaptation or mitigation. There's lack of these issues that we see, and we see a lot of companies going to invest in Africa, but they cannot actually build like a drainage system to make sure that there's flooding, and they're just driving their cars in like like huge floods,
Yeah.
but they don't actually see that picture of how do we invest in a company in this country so that they have a great drainage system where the water can be harvested, in some way. But there's all these kind of things, right? I think it's not about. I think it boils down to climate equity, right? Where
Hmm.
we need to ensure that investment actually makes sense for everyone, and and people that are affected by climate change. Those needs are addressed.
Hmm.
We don't see it here. I think this is why it's important for you, Thomas, as well, to take a step out of the Nordic bubble.
Hmm.
Uh, take a trip. There's a place very there's a place in Ghana. It's called Agboblashi. It's a scrap yard. Now, this is not a scrap yard managed by the government. It's a scrap yard that is, that where people who are trying to find a job are harvesting electronic waste from Europe. These are
Okay.
people breaking computers and breaking monitors and PCBs and motherboards to just get a little bit of the minerals that is left in that. And
Hmm.
these are things that are coming from Europe, right? Can you imagine that?
Yeah.
They all end up in that place. It's called Agboblashi. You should check it out.
Okay.
It's a sorry side. When you see that, right? It's like it's the second, I think, from Chernobyl in terms of like toxicity of because they're burning stuff, right? They're it's just I don't know. I just feel like very emotional when I see that kind of a picture and see, oh, this is all coming from Europe because we consume so much here. We
Yeah.
buy 5 keyboards and 10 keyboards. We don't know where they end up, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, we think the government is going to sort that stuff out. No, the government doesn't sort everything out. It's costly. They might send it somewhere, and that these guys end up throwing it in Africa. And these are things that we see as well, right? Creating that lack of, I don't know, I would say creating more waste streams in Africa, but also also pollution that comes with that. So I think for me, I think I'm really, really, um, you know, I'm just saddened to see living in Europe for the last 8 years, how much we consume stuff, we buy new stuff every day, new TV, and then it ends up in a scrapyard that is almost like in flames in Africa, in Ghana,
Yeah.
or some other places, right? And this is overconsumption that is happening here.
Yeah.
You know, it's I think for me that just like, just saddens me to the core, because I know most of this stuff that people are selling in these big stores, once it's broken, it can't be fixed. It's going to be sold to some company, and that company is going to deposit that to the ship and then just throw it out in there. So you can
100%.
imagine that, right? It's all climate change, overconsumption, that is creating obviously emissions, but also the waste streams as well.
Okay, we just got cut off, Kenny, but we'll just continue straight where we left off. So you were telling me about overconsumption, the
Right.
scrapyard in Ghana, and that's just a great example for the need for circularity. So if you're in the electronics industry, you're thinking about how do I make my supply chain more sustainable, you should definitely think about how do I avoid that I create all of these waste streams that end up going to Africa. There's these great examples now coming up in regulation where countries like Austria, they have now introduced subsidies for getting your electronics repaired. So that definitely helps create an economic business case. But one of the core issues for what we were talking about before is really poverty, right? Because the reason that people end up in these horrible working conditions is not just because the waste is there, but also because there's of course a local poverty issues in those countries. And now, with all of the human rights due diligence that's coming up, companies need to mitigate their social risks in the supply chain, reduce it. And that creates an unfortunate effect of even sometimes pulling out of some of these high risk countries
Mm.
and just source it locally instead. But I guess that's just making the poverty issues worse. So you're actually making the problem worse, not better. What do you think about that, Kenny? How do we mitigate the social risks, but maybe increase the investments from high risk countries?
Yeah, very very good question, Thomas. Thank you so much for following up on that note. Um, yeah, the example that I gave, in Ghana, this place called Agbobloshi, it's a very sorry site, obviously. If you look into unemployment, obviously, like you mentioned, that is a really, really big concern over there. And, unemployment obviously goes with poverty, and everybody wants to survive, right? But I think it's just the nature of, where these, electronic waste, especially from Europe, is coming through, going to be dumped in Ghana. Some of the things work, some is just like, they've just reached their end of life. And
Mhm.
yeah, and people are just like harvesting whatever stuff that they need to do to make sure that they get something out of it to go to market, right? To sell in terms of like small minerals in there. So the problem obviously is, the age of high mass consumption that obviously we are undergoing. From the European side, living in Norway for some time, I see people throwing TVs, like brand new TVs, which
Mhm.
like, whoa, wow, this is crazy. But in a way, we see that the problem, obviously, you know, the lack of a circular economy model working in these places. I don't see it working. There's been
Mhm.
a little bit of a push on that, on the policy side, but maybe as at the bigger level of the EU Commission coming in to make sure that they create incentives for circularity. Pretty much, I think that's going to be very critical for ensuring that there is a system, obviously, where people are not just dumping stuff. There is a system where which actually could create opportunities as well for people in these countries. For example, in Ghana, right? So
Mhm.
it's the risk is there, but it's just a risk of overproducing and overconsumption that is on this side of the planet.
Mhm.
I would appreciate most of these situations that we see. Most of the people that are harvesting these, they don't have these elements like I always see these TVs and computers. They don't have that, right? It's most of the things that are coming from here. But at the end of the day, the risks are going to be there. But it's just like, how do you create opportunities for people in these developing countries, right? I would, in any way, I would look into major companies that are producing these equipments to kind of like set up uh, recycling processes. In obviously, if it doesn't work here, there could be a recycling process maybe in a place like Ghana, right? That
Hmm.
actually works for these big companies that we see, with their major brands there. But I think the thing is that it's not right to throw away stuff in another continent just because you don't have use for it. It's reached its end of life. But at the end of the day, I think I would love to see, you know, responsibility, companies taking responsibility on things that they see. Like, there is stuff that ends up obviously in these places. What is the
Hmm.
next step to do? Right? Is setting up infrastructure where
Hmm.
people could be trained. There's issues around pollution, which is very critical because they're burning this stuff. But the health and safety part, I think there's a lot of cancer obviously coming from these places that nobody has tracked that yet. So I definitely believe that companies take responsibility to go to these places and see how much they can find their products in that pool of or scrap or of trash, and trying to create a process that could actually help these people to make sure that it's a little bit more structured. The damage is already done.
Hmm.
There is a lot of this stuff out there already, but cleaning up that is about burning stuff. And I think I would love to see major companies, stepping up, going to these places and setting up facilities that could help clean up the actual damage that is already there today, but also setting
Yeah.
up systems of, you said circularity, right? That could actually help these countries create jobs for people who are working, who have skills. Obviously, maybe they need to be upskilled in this area of, repair and all these kind of things. But at the end of the day, I think when you take that responsibility to say, we can actually create a factory where we can do recycling or support companies' investment that could make sure that waste streams that are already there, or I hope not some going to those places, could be in a process where there is an actual process of recycling, and people are
Hmm.
given opportunities to actually work in these places. There is job creation there, but in the current state, very specific for that example, Thomas, I think it's a little bit of a challenge, right? And this
Yeah.
is why, at the high level, from the European side, obviously they should be avoided, but also governments to invest in the circular economic systems, where there is a system where things don't actually end up leaking, in places like Ghana, like we said, right? So the
Hmm.
risks are going to be there, but I think it's just like, how do we create opportunities now, and try to find solutions from what is happening in these places? Yeah, there's
Yeah.
still huge damage, there's still pollution, there's still health and safety issues until now. But we definitely want to see companies also going to say, can we create something to help these mitigate that, especially in these places? Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
know if I answered the question, but yeah, there's an opportunity for helping these people to have jobs, obviously,
Hmm.
but there is also an opportunity as well for companies to do right, in terms of setting up the right economic model. Like we said, circularity is going to be very key, and that
Hmm.
has to be driven by the regional organization like the EU Commission.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll
I,
definitely dive deep into that. And
I think that's a great point, Kenny. So it's not just about making sure that you design your future products to have the right end of use life cycle, but it's also acknowledging that, hey, we've made quite a bit of a mess today, and maybe we should actually go together as an industry coalition to say, what do we do about these places where you have these major buildup of waste, and
mm,
how do we make sure that the unavoidable labor that will probably happen there to extract the value from the minerals and electronics and all of these things happens under safe working practices.
absolutely, absolutely, I think that's going to be very critical. Like, just as you've put it, right, for companies to step up and do something, and it has to be very much a coalition, right, where
Hmm.
companies say our products are actually in there as well. How do
Hmm.
we track them? I think there's an example with Dell. I think Dell, they have tried to create um, kind of like a policy, I think in the US, that the US government, or maybe the states, they cannot export any waste from Dell products. So
Hmm.
that's actually very good. I think that's tape from Dell, that you cannot export waste from with Dell products, right? Branded products. And I think that's actually a great step that they took. But of course, right, there's still poverty there. Again, how would you? I think in a with that example of Dell, I would definitely set up something, especially now that they reach you like Dell products in that. Set up that local recycling process that is organized, that is creating jobs, and and if there's anything with Dell that goes through that waste stream ends up in that place, there is a place where there's a process of job creation, but also like a
Mhm.
recycling process. It's kind of like, I mean, there could be opportunities, right? If there's no capacity here with labor, and there is capacity obviously in Africa for labor, and it's just like setting up the right infrastructure and the right conditions for people to work, right, and the environment as well. So it shouldn't end up uh, in a scrapyard where everyone is like burning, and there's just pollution and very toxic environment. But if these companies, obviously, like we said, they could set up like industries for recycling of this product, that's good as well, you know
Mhm.
and then at the end of the day, they would actually be able to have this as well from what they can get from these recycling plants, right, than just like taking 42,000 tons of waste to landfill, and then it's just burned, and people are just like working there without any conditions for safety, but also
Mhm.
for health as well. Yeah.
Got it. No, that's interesting. So back to kind of the supply chain and supplier collaboration perspective, it's really more about how do we double down on our high risk sourcing countries rather than moving labor back to low risk countries, because we'll just make the poverty issue worse. We more need to think about how can we create healthy and safety jobs. You talked about earlier when you described a little bit your story in oil and gas. You talked about how you know almost illogical it was that you pick up the oil locally, then you ship it to Europe, you treat it, you then ship it back and sell it at 10x the price locally
Mm.
again where it was originally sourced. Were there any discussions back then for just like creating the refineries close to where they got the ingredients? And do you know kind of what were why is that not being done more?
Yeah, good question, Thomas. Yeah, I mean, I think that just to get to that one, the supply chain for oil and gas is very conservative, right, and very traditional. And that's how it works for now, right? I think nobody has disrupted that, especially with I mean, in the US, obviously, in developed countries, there's refineries that are built already, and they're able to refine that. But I think in these low, income countries where there's these, oil and gas resources there, we haven't seen much of refinery, investments where the oil is being produced and then it's refined. Uh, During my time in the oil and gas, it was the same stuff, right? Pretty much everything coming from Europe, and then the oil once it's produced, and then it goes back to another country to get refined, and then back to the country with an X, 10x, a value, a premium value on top of that. That doesn't work, that has created a little bit more, access to that energy is really expensive, especially for local people. They can't afford that. And you know so there's a lot of issues around that kind of a model, right?
Hmm.
And setting up that refinery could help obviously reduce the cost of these energy products in that country, because then you're able to refine and then distribute across, right? But right now that doesn't work, because obviously the oil and gas industry is very traditional.
Hmm.
It's conservative, and people make a profit out of that kind of a system, right? I don't think it's going to be very expensive to create, you know, a refinery. If these major companies, investing in Angola, in Nigeria, able to like say, hey, why don't we actually do it? To set up like a refinery that could help even the local people to benefit from that, right? And
Hmm.
that setting up a refinery, you're talking about thousands of jobs, and all these kind of things that are, the core benefits to that, but doesn't work, right? I think the economics of oil production in one country, and then like especially in developing countries like Angola, then it's been cleaned up in another country, and then it comes back. That's pretty much the supply chain, and if you disrupt that, you know, there's going to be a lot of gaps, right? Of shipping companies and tankers, and
Hmm.
these companies might be out of work eventually. So I don't know if you want to keep the status quo, but I
Hmm.
think for ethical reasons, I think that has to change, right? Because then if you set up a refinery in one location, you're going to create thousands of jobs to the local community. The local community is going to benefit in access to energy products like oil and fuels. I think that if I'm that major company, I would definitely look into that model to make sure that also whatever we're producing. I mean, these guys are making 10x profits,
Hmm.
so I don't think that is going to be a very hard, milestone to create a refinery. And that refinery, maybe they'll have some percentage of whatever stuff they'll be refining, right? So it's just how the model, the traditional and the conservative supply chain for oil and gas works, right?
Hmm.
It works like that. There's a lot of companies in, suppliers and sub suppliers in that, and it just goes on and on. I think disrupting that to more local refineries is going to be very critical. Obviously,
Hmm.
for local communities to, like I said, to have jobs, but also for a thriving, economy as well, where they could actually have that technology exports, but also technology import as well. When experts are coming in, they're sharing their expertise. Like I told you, from the last minister, we had earlier, that we are building like major oil and gas, production systems, subsea production systems in Angola, right? Which was
Hmm.
great. There was a lot of technology transfer. That was a great approach by the company that I worked with. Then it was a great approach. Like, a lot of people learn from that process on how to build, subsea production systems, either, like upstream and downstream on oil and gas equipments. That was very good. Now the local community, the population right now, at least there's a number of people that we can trust to say they can build products. We can build products locally because we've gained that experience, we've gained that technology, we've gained that knowledge. I think there's all these issues that when you're looking to that checklist, I think you definitely need to see, if I'm going to invest in X country, why don't we actually set up this? It's going to create this, this kind of impact, and the economic inclusion, the social inclusion, and checking on those SDGs. I think those are really critical if you're setting up, you know what I mean, right? These kind of systems, or if you want to invest in a country, I think that has to be like the broader view than just like 10x profits and then you leave, and yeah, the
Yeah.
population for the last, for the next 10 years is still the same. There's no change, right? But you've been in the country for 70 years. Like, that's a lot. Uh, that's a lot of years, but then you're not actually creating the actual impact. The impact is more on the financial impact, obviously from the company, and not looking into the broader picture of the economy, the local economy as well. I think that's really critical. Yeah. So I think,
100%.
like, just to sum up that point, it's pretty much all the conservative, or the traditional supply chain within the oil and gas. That's how it works. I think if there's going to be a change within how it actually works, they focus on more refinery from like local economies, and then they can export the oil. That's going to be huge. It's going to take a lot of people out of poverty, create a lot of jobs, and other core benefits as well. In terms of
Yeah.
SDGs, yeah, I think that's the way forward. I would imagine the future
Yeah.
of, if you really want to produce in the country, produce, refine locally, and then you can transport that. I mentioned about the global. I think from the last discussion, where there's the global, obviously the global part, but also the local part, which should be very much involved into the whole process of these minerals. They belong to those countries. Yeah, of course, the financial power, is in the hands of people that invest in that project, or that venture. But obviously, the local, involvement and the local growth and economy should actually be prioritized as well.
100%. And it actually, so I think what's really interesting there is we see in other industries like the consumer products industry that a lot of the key initiatives that are being created right now is to say, if you sell to, let's say, Indonesia, and you
Hmm.
source a lot of the ingredients in Indonesia, you should be able to manufacture the products in Indonesia as well. So really kind of moving manufacturing to hopefully where consumption is, and ideally where resource extraction is also. And I think that's really interesting, because there is a business case, right, that's been proven around having more optimized production by being closer to your end user, and being closer to the resources, but also, labor efficiencies and these kind of things. But it's a major bit. So I think that's really interesting. But I want to shift a little bit gears, Kenny. I
Let me
want
just
to,
come down
yeah.
on that point before you move to the point. I just like an example on that one.
Mm-hmm.
In Ghana, they produce cocoa, right, which is like a
Mm-hmm.
byproduct of for making chocolate, and that chocolate is actually not made in Ghana. The raw materials are transported obviously to many places that are we call today these very branded chocolates from Switzerland or you know other places, but most of it is resource, right, for that
Mm-hmm.
cocoa. The raw materials to actually make that chocolate today is, and you're talking about Ghana again. That's another example, right? But then there's no system in Ghana in terms of like the value chain that actually creates the whole process where they can actually make chocolate from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's going to be like one of the examples that I would say, creating that local manufacturing in that place, right? You're making Swiss chocolates. Okay, why don't you make actually chocolates from Ghana? You can brand it Swiss
Mm-hmm.
uh, if you want to, but at least try to see how you can actually create more impact in that local economy by creating a value chain around that, and then you can have that chocolate with a Swiss badge, or so it's that kind of thinking there. But if
Yeah.
it's not like that, then there's a lot of people that don't have jobs today because you just produce raw materials and then that's it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like
Like Apple
farming. And,
products designed in
yeah,
California, manufactured in China.
look at that. You can imagine how that would impact the economy, right? If it was actually produced locally. Of course, the economics sometimes they might not make sense, but I think it's just like mass production and that we're focused on today, and mass consumption. That might be the problem there that we need to fix here.
Mm-hmm. 100%. A big thing is trust, and I want to talk a little bit about trust, because what we see with a lot of companies is they now are caring a lot more about ESG with their suppliers, or maybe they have a sustainable procurement organization. They want to ensure that the right working practices are in place, no child labor, health and safety, all of these kind of things. And as a result, maybe they start auditing some of their suppliers. Maybe they rely on certification other places and so on. But they have a real question about trust. Like, how can I trust that, there's indeed no child labor at that factory that was just audited, or that what the supplier submitted here was correct? You did quality assurance audits in your previous role. Can you tell me a little bit about how did the trust component play into it? When you did those audits, like when did you need to go deeper? What tactics did you employ?
Yeah, good question, Thomas. Yeah, I mean it's trust. I mean it's a thing that I've kind of like delved very deeply in Norway.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very maybe the Nordics as well. I included Denmark, where you're from. There's this trust-based model, right? And for
Mm-hmm.
me, looking to that, I'm like, wow, this actually works. To do a lot of stuff, business, and to do most of these, work tasks as well. In terms of audits, and I think the Norwegian system, like maybe in the Nordics as well, it's very much trust-based. But going back to my experience. It's very hard though. I would say trust is a really hard metric that you need to reach
Mm-hmm.
uh, because then it all boils down to the culture, behind that trust, right? It's a culture. So if there is a culture where we go into a place, for example, to do audits and to check, the responsibilities, on HSC for suppliers that we want to engage. We look into their numbers, obviously the HSC metrics, like KPIs. We look into that. We do like the actual visits as well into these places where we see, if everything is in place. We talk to some of the employees as well, but usually this could be like role played, right? Where there's just like it's just a setup because
Mm-hmm.
then they know obviously that you're coming to do audits. That's the experience. in most cases, from where I come from, that there was that level of people just trying to make sure that they do the hard work the day before the auditors come, right? Or before the company that wants to to check on your numbers. You make sure
Hmm.
that you sweep everything under the rug. Everything looks shiny. People are happy around. It could be just something that people are just playing, because the trust, I think, should be based on the culture that is built, right? I think this is how you definitely actually measure uh, how do you actually trust these processes. Yeah, the numbers, the paperwork, the checklist could be like very excellent. You can just like tick 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 tick, everything is like really good, but it's just the culture that after that audit, or after that process of a visit where you check on the suppliers or sub suppliers, subcontractors, to see what they do. uh, you know After that process, I think everything goes back to the same stuff, right? They
Yeah,
just
that's the fear.
they just forget about whatever stuff was, even like small recommendations that you need to improve on that. Yeah, they're like, oh, we'll do that, but then you're not gonna go back there, right? Because you've done your work already. As a contractor, you say, oh, I've been to their factory, looks good, looks shiny. We've checked the numbers, we've checked all this data that they have, their KPIs. But at the end of the day, it's just the culture that they actually, turn the page and say, hey, let's continue as we started. I think that's a really hard thing, especially on trust. So you cannot just use trust as a metric, especially when you're going to sub suppliers, suppliers. I think you need to look into the culture around that trust, right?
Hmm.
How is the culture built around that? On systems and processes that they say, oh, we have this process, we have this system in place, and then you just check what is the culture around that. I think if you look into those numbers, I think that's going to be very hard as well. Maybe a good challenge for you, Thomas, with responsibly, to look into processes and audits. Like, what is the culture around those, those processes, right, or audits or systems? I think once you understand the culture behind that, you know that the culture is actually could be trusted. If they say we do this, and this good, that could be a culture, right? At the end of the
Hmm.
day, and you can actually pretty much trust that process or trust that system that it actually works.
Yeah.
The HSC management system, it's a really hard thing to, we try within HSC to build this HSC culture, but it's really hard because it's like different mindsets and all these kind of things. But I think companies that have actually built that culture where people are like more open, they can talk to their bosses, and in some of the places this doesn't happen, right? Because there's like this hierarchy where you just have to keep quiet, because it's cultural. So there's all these
Mm.
like very traditional culture, or like native culture, which is like where I come from, the village that I come from. I have like boundaries of things that I need to do, right? Respect the elders and do that and do that. And then I go to this workplace, and then there's another work culture that I need to kind of like understand. And so I think there's all these, if you look like down to trust, I think it's that could boil down to the culture, obviously, that actually works for that system when they say we do this, and then you check what is the culture around that. Not just like what is the paperwork, where is the paperwork here, because people are
Hmm.
always gonna make up like HSC metrics, very good stuff, because they need to get that contract.
Hmm.
So they definitely need to do everything they can. So if there's things that obviously doesn't work for some that hasn't been working for some time, they'll make sure that that actually works that day that you go to do the audits. Yeah. So let me just sum it up. I think it's more the cultural audits. I think are really important to go with the trust. I
Hmm.
think that actually builds the trust model of going to suppliers, sub suppliers. I think it has to be the culture that you need to look into deeply. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't see that. I think that's the big iceberg. Down in the sea there. Because then you don't see just see one part of it that is clean, but the bigger part of the organizations are not. They haven't built that culture for you know, doing the right thing or setting up the right processes
Yeah,
over time, not just a short time, over time. Yeah.
100%. I think that's a great point, Kenny. I think that's something that can get missed out of the audit mentality sometimes. I remember reading about these stories in the US in the food processing industry where there were child labor problems spotted in more than, I think, 50% of the ones that had actually been cleared for child labor in an audit, simply because, the audits happened during the day, and then the miners came in on the night shift and the auditors weren't there, right? So they would say, hey, there's no child labor here. And
Yeah.
what you're arguing for, which I really like, is saying, hey, it's not just enough to understand binary whether or not these things are happening, but we need to understand what's the culture actually at this supplier, and are things not happening just because there's an audit scheduled and everything is cleaned up before, or are
Yeah.
things not happening because we have the right mindset, the right attitude, the right cultural values in that supplier? Like, all very fuzzy and hard to assess, but probably, you always say change is about culture, right? So
Mm.
probably one of the more important things, and also why we probably need to be there in person when we do audits. We cannot just do it as a document audit. You need somebody to be there in person to sense the culture and meet the people there, at least at one part of the due diligence process.
I totally agree, right? It's just it's a great example as well. These are things that happen in the day. It's like, yeah, we don't have human rights, no child labor, and then yeah, in the night, there's no eyes, and yeah. So I think there has to be transparency, obviously,
Mhm.
within that, the trust and the cultural aspect of that due diligence process, right? Than just going in, check stuff, and then you leave, right? Yeah.
100%. No, that's fascinating. Kenny, this was amazing. Really, really appreciate this. Any last words you want to leave our listeners with on how to get started with supply chain sustainability?
Good question. Yeah, I think it's more. Yeah, I think it's been a great chat as well. Supply chain sustainability obviously right now is focused on CO2. I think there are other things that we need to focus on. Social, like you've been
Mhm.
pushing that agenda there. That's very important. Human rights and all those ESG material issues that we see. Those are like really supply chain conundrums, right? That we need to definitely look into. Than just focusing on CO2. Right now, obviously, it's like scope 3 emissions, and everybody's focused on that. But beyond that, I think there's very serious issues of human rights and child labor and modern slavery that are happening. I think being that supply chain, responsible, or somebody who's working within that domain, I think it's just that mindset to actually understand the broader aspect, the broader picture of not just CO2 or making a
Mhm.
profit out of these beads. I think is understanding pretty much getting the broader uh, overview of how what actually affects what, right? Because everything is connected to everything else. It's human rights, it's child labor, it's I think that having that mindset as a supply chain officer or supply chain responsible, I think that's going to be very important. And I think most procurement people who work within procurement, they don't have that broader aspect. I think
Mhm.
just training and development around obviously these issues that are happening. I think maybe you guys with responsibly could provide that as well. Just to upskill this process, these departments, this domain, people that have been there obviously for a long time, to make sure that they understand the broader aspects of ESG within supply chain, but also responsibility within supply chains. Yeah, but at the end of the day, I think the future obviously of supply chain is not it's local, is which is global. Obviously, some part of it global and very much local, but also circularity as well. I think I'll just end from that. Yeah.
Mhm. Fantastic. Kenny, that was great. Thank you so much for coming on Next Frontier.
Yeah, great. I mean, I'm looking forward to listen to this one and many others. I'm sure there's going to be great guests that you're going to be bringing on. So yeah, so happy and so privileged to be part of this. Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you, Thomas.
If you're still here, then first of all, thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts about this episode or what you'd like to hear more of, you can email us at thomas@nextfrontier.earth. We really do read every email. You can also hit me up directly on LinkedIn. Just search for Thomas Buch Andersen. That's Thomas B-U-C-H Andersen. If you feel like it, please share with your friends and subscribe wherever you listen to our podcast. We also have a YouTube channel. It's on @NextFrontierEarth if you want to see what we actually look like in person. And if you really love the show, hit us with that 5-star review. Today's episode was produced and edited by Christina Sotu, and Next Frontier music is by Keyhole. See you next time.